Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Build It with Tim. On today's episode, we are talking about some extracurricular functions that we are doing outside of our Tadabase application, and we're going to be using make to do this. We're going to be iterating through a date range field so that we can find out all of the dates within the date range field and create new records in another table for each one of the dates. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. We'll take a look at the builder itself and, of course, make and build this out for you. Okay, first things first, we have a very, very simple data structure. Okay, so all I want to show you here today is the minimum requirements for doing this. And there's going to be two tables. We're going to have one table that actually contains the date range field. The second table is going to be a connected child table. This table is going to contain a connection field that goes back to the date range table. Okay, so every single date range that we have here, we're going to find out all of the days between the start and the end date. And then we're going to create individual records with that particular date, and each one is going to connect back to the parent record, whatever that may be. But this parent record is the one that contains the actual date range. Okay, so that's all we need for the data structure. We're inside of Make, and what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be building actually a fairly simple scenario to handle all of this logic. Okay, so there's going to be about 4 steps that we need. Your scenario might vary if you need to build in any additional logic, but in my case, again, this is the kind of base requirements for the operation that we're doing. It's going to be about 4 pieces of logic. The first one, we're going to somehow receive the data from our Tadabase application. So that can be done in a number of different ways. You could schedule it. You can also trigger it via a webhook. So I'm going to show you the webhook method now. Then we need to calculate how many days are in between the start date and the end date of the date range. Then we're going to use something called the repeater module in order to output a certain number of bundles that make uses in order to fire the next module. And the next module will be create a record. So then based on the number of repeats that the repeater module outputted, we'll create a record that is the start date plus how many days we need to add to it. So the first thing I want to cover here in Make is actually in your profile. I suggest using some sort of going to your profile and editing your time zone so that you can, and we're going to, set the time zone to something that is GMT plus 0. So we want the times to come in as like UTC essentially. So we want to set that up when working with dates inside of Make. You don't have to always do this. If you want to, you can use any of the calendar functions inside of Make to add hours or subtract hours based on the date time value that comes into Make and the date time value that leaves Make going back to Tadabase. Because remember, your Tadabase application has a time zone associated to it, and so does Make. So in order for the things to be as compatible as possible, I suggest just setting Make to GMT plus 0. So that you don't have to convert anything. Anyways, we're going to go into this particular scenario, and we're going to start with that webhook. So I've already created one here, but you're going to search for the Tadabase module and select Watch Records, and then you're going to create a new webhook. You're going to add your API credentials to this in order to make the connection between this particular webhook and your application, and select the data table, and then it will provide you with a web address. Okay, then inside of your application, we're going to go to automation and outgoing webhooks and paste those values in here for the URL. And you can see I've set up 2 webhooks. They both run on the date range table, but one is for a new record event and one is for an update record event. Okay, so that means when I now update this record, I have to do that again here, so I'll update this one more time. And this will receive the record data that we need. So the table ID, the record ID of the record that was created or updated, and then the individual field values. In this case, the auto increment. This is a roll-up field, and then the date range. Okay, so And this is what I was referring to with the date time value. So since we set make to be UTC, then it's coming in exactly how it's supposed to. All right, so the next thing that we're going to be doing is setting up our two like tool modules in this case. So the first one is actually located in the tools category, and it's going to be called set variable. So we're going to add that here. And what we're going to be doing here is um, get number of days. You can call this whatever you want, but we're going to be getting the number of days. And here is the formula that we need to use. So I'm going to replace these values here with my end date and my start date. But what we're doing is we're subtracting the start date from the end date. Then we are dividing it by 1,000, by 60, by 60, by 24, and then rounding that particular value. And the reason being is that if you just do the end date minus the start date, you're going to get an output in seconds. So we need to convert that from seconds to days. Okay, so now when I run this again, you'll see the value that we get out of this is a number value of days, a whole number of days. Okay, so that is the value that we're going to work with, 6 days. Now, it's not 100% accurate. Okay, and what I mean by that is if we look at the actual date range, if we look at the calendar, we start on the 27th and we end on Saturday the 3rd. So if we count the days, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So what we need to do is we actually need to go in through here. And so the only reason that that is because it either doesn't count the start date or it doesn't technically count the end date. So in order to make sure that when we're creating records for every single day within the range, we need to just add one additional day to the value that we received here. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to set up is the repeater. So this is a cool module that essentially lets us just define an initial value and then how many times we want this thing to run, the number of bundles that are necessary for the next module. So in this case, we need the 7 bundles because we need to create 7 records. So we're going to do the number of days and then we're going to add 1. Okay, and the reason we start with 0, sorry, I should have explained this. The reason that we start with 0 is because when we are creating records, we're going to do the start date plus a number. And the first one that we're going to create is the start date plus 0 days because we actually want to create a record with just the start date. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is add another Tadabase module, and that's going to be create a record. So we're going to search for Tadabase again, and this time we're going to choose create a record. We'll select the table that we're actually going to create records in. In this case, it's going to be the connected table, the child table that is going to hold the dates. And for the date, we are going to add days to our start time. So we're going to go to the calendar section here and we're going to choose add days. And the first value we need to feed it is the start date because this is the date, the date value we're going to add days to. And then the number of days is going to come from the repeater. Okay, now for the date range, this is a connection field, right? This is a connection back to the parent record. And the parent record is the one that came in through the webhook originally. So we can use the record ID here. Now, connections will always need a record ID, especially when you're working with our API, which is essentially what Make is doing here. So in order to set this connection value, we need to set it with the record ID of the initial record. So we're going to run this now, and we're going to edit this record and then quickly switch back over here so that you can see everything working now. So we're going to receive the webhook. We're going to get the number of days in between, and in this case, we add 1 to it to give us 7 bundles, starting with 0 and ending with 6. Then we created 7 records, where the first record is for November 27th at 12 a.m., which is the start of our date range, and then moving on with 1 day added to each record. Okay, now we can go back to our application and look at the dates table here, and you can see now that we have a record for each one. Now, I opted to choose a regular date field, not a date time field for this, because all I care about in this case is the actual dates in between and not the time values. So here we have, right, one record for each date inside of this particular date range. Each one also has the connection or the correct connection back to the parent record. And then the parent record has this roll-up field to let us know how many connected date records there are. Okay, so it's just that easy. It's 4 modules. The logic is pretty straightforward. There just has to be some additional calculation to convert things, right, from the seconds to actual number of days. And then depending on your time zone preferences, you may have to add in um, some sort of date time conversion where you're adding hours to adjust for time zones accordingly. Okay, but that's essentially it. That's the whole process. It's pretty straightforward. I've had this asked a few times on how to do this based on different use cases. So I'm excited to see what other use cases people have for it. It can certainly help out with various applications such as booking applications. Okay, so any questions, of course, feel free to let me know. And that's it for today's episode. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.